Today we want to talk about Remix.
Yeah.
We are working on finishing up a Remix course. It is, what's today? Let me check here, October 12th. And so we got 2 weeks left in the month. So by the end of October, we're going to have Remix all done. I think we're currently on lesson 12 and probably about like 3 or 4 more lessons to go. I got 2 of them recorded and we'll wrap it up soon after that. So we thought...
Why don't you tell us about the app you're building?
Yep. So the app that we're building is a work journal app. And it's something that I added to my personal website a couple years ago. And it was a fun little personal project to use. And so I thought it was a good example of an app that shows off the architecture of Remix. So that's what we build in the course. And it's basically like a simplified blog where you can add entries. And then the data display is kind of like a weekly grouped format. And just is a nice little app that shows off CRUD capabilities and Remix and highlights kind of the fundamentals of the architecture of a Remix app. So it's fun because at the end of the course, you're going to get the code base, you get the diffs all the way through, but you can actually take the app at the end and deploy it yourself and keep working on it. So I had this idea because a lot of the side projects I've done over the years on YouTube, people are like, oh, is this deployed? Can I work on this? Or can you add this feature? And that led me to think of these kinds of like self-contained apps that are a good starting point for learning a new technology. And then now that you're at the end, you feel like equipped to add features, which is a lot of the ways that I learn new tech. So I thought it would be fun in this episode to just talk about kind of the Remix architecture and some of the highlights of what's covered in the course. And, you know, as we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of similarities with the new stuff coming to Next in React Server components in terms of which parts of the things that we're used to doing in React on the client are better handled by web browsers and HTTP, and how that kind of saves us some work. But how it doesn't mean we shouldn't reach for React when we need it. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what I thought would be good to go through.
Cool.
Okay, so I think the best way to talk about kind of the Remix architecture is to just talk about, you know, the home page and say we have a static page. Basically, there's a few parts that are common to every route in a Remix app. You have a loader, you have the page component, and then when you want to make changes, you use a form, and that submits an action.
So the journal, you add entries, and it shows everything grouped by week. So I can see like basically a journal of all the things you worked on this week.
Right.
So how, where are those entries stored?
So those are in a database, and when you load the home page, it fetches all the entries from the database. And in Remix, you do this with a loader for the index route. So kind of starting at the top, you want to make a home page that shows all the entries. You do that by creating a new route file. So if you've used Next, it's like a page file. It's a component, a React component associated with the URL. But the cool thing about Remix is that there is an optional export that you can do alongside any route called a loader. And this is integrated with Remix's router. And so when you put the URL into the address bar and hit enter, if there's a loader, it'll run. That's an async function, so it can block on it, just like a server-side language would. And then once that returns the response, and in our case, we're fetching data through Prisma from an SQLite database, which is part of the architecture because it makes it really easy to deploy to fly. It hands those off to the React component. It also server renders those, server-side rendering. And so the initial response is HTML, which is generated at the time of the request. So again, different from other tools, there's no static generation in Remix. This is just more like an old school PHP kind of thing. Request, fetch data, render HTML, respond. But then there's also your code is bundled and loaded on the client and hydrated, just like you would with any React framework that has server-side rendering. So similar to how we, considering what we've been talking about with React Server components the last few weeks, this is different in the sense that there's really one flow here that responds with HTML, and then there's also script tags that are in your main layout that load the React app and hydrate everything in your page. But at this point in time with Remix, everything is server-side rendered, and then everything is hydrated. So that's how it works. And that means that in your page components, you're just writing React components. And so you can add state and click handlers. And during the server-side render, obviously those don't do anything in the same way that if you pre-render a client component doesn't do anything in a next app. But it makes for a really nice developer experience. You have your page right there. You can fetch data in a function right above it. And then as soon as you need state or any React features, you can just go to town right there. So it's really fun to work on. And you start off on a single page, you fetch data, you render it, and then you just keep going. And if you need to break out components, for example, we iterate over and group all of the entries by weeks because they have dates with them. We use data FNs. We could do some transforms in the loader. We do some transforms in the component. And we pull out like an entry list item component and put it in the same file. It's all there. And it's just a really nice developer experience.
It's pretty cool. It sounds like you get to use the loader to load maybe massage data. And then you get to use the component as almost like a templating language.
Yes.
For that data.
Yes.
Feels like the aspects of web development that I really like.
Yes.
So,
and for folks who haven't had experience with a framework, a React framework that has data fetching methods like get server-side props and next, or a loader and remix. So for folks who have been doing data fetching in the client with like React Query or SWR, or just writing their own fetch code and effects, this kind of simple piece of the architecture gets you a lot because it's integrated with the router. And so the default loading state is just the browser that's blocked, which is nice because browsers know how to load websites and to show feedback on every device that a website is loading. So you don't get these kind of like blank screens. You get like a browser spinner while the server is working. And same with clicking links. If you, again, going back to when we started writing React apps and you're doing your fetching on the client, clicking a link, what does that do? Does it transition immediately? How do you kick off the data fetch? What happens if I hit back and then the data fetch finishes? All of that kind of stuff is built into loaders and pages and Remix's router, which is actually just React router. And it all works really nice. So there's lots of little things that are handled for you if you use the tools, the conventions in the framework to do things like load data and render pages.
So it's not just like, you're not just taking an effect and running it on the server. It's like you get this whole, you get all the, because you're using the router, you get all these like, what, like little edge cases covered for you?
Yeah. So for example, when you read the Remix homepage, you see things like, you know, this is a framework based on the web fundamentals and HTTP. And the web and the browsers are good at things like following links, loading new pages, and then rendering them. Browsers are also really good at back and forward navigation. And if you went to Wikipedia and click a bunch of links, again, browsers are really good at figuring out which resources aren't needed anymore. They're good at caching. They're good at interrupting, so you can click back a lot and not have your app screw up. When we moved all of our functionality to the client side because we wanted to do richer UI interactions using JavaScript and React, but we also brought along all those pieces of the web, we didn't realize as like a community right away how many little details there were to get those right. So if you have effects that you add and you render a component that doesn't have data and then it has a loading state and then it fetches and then you interrupt that because you click another link before the fetch finishes, it's really hard to consider that state machine, that router, which is a state machine, and all the valid ways to go through it. That's basically taken care of for you with this architecture. So that's like one of the core backbone pieces of application architecture in Remix. And it's really, really nice to work with. Cool. Because it just gives you, it's like we had a discussion a month or two ago about the baseline SPA experience. This raises the baseline a lot. And yet you are still using a fully hydrated client-side React app once the app is loaded. So it's like kind of bending the trade-off curve is the best of both worlds.
It's still an SPA.
Still an SPA.
But you raise the baseline. That's
Yes.
a really good, Yes. That's a nice little nugget.
So I think Remix did a lot in this area. to just help people realize which things we were doing in our apps that were better suited for, right? Because client-side navigation is still a really powerful thing and raises the ceiling, even over, a Rails framework, for example, because if you navigate in the client, you don't have to reload the header, let's say. You don't have to reload script tags for analytics services. You can do transitions. You can do all sorts of cool things if you do client-side navigation. But if you go from completely server-side routing to client-side routing, including the data fetching, there's a lot of these in-between things that you lose. So I think one of the things that's most important about using go ahead.
I was going to say, it's also really nice that something like Remix can show us that these problems aren't inherent to an SPA.
Exactly.
That there is a way where you can use the stuff that the browser is good at.
Exactly. And I think that's kind of like what the whole React front-end community is figuring out right now, which is that you could imagine, the way I think about like SPAs and, Ember, which is how we got started, is like we want to do the kinds of things we see on native apps on the web. And for that, you need to be as close to the user as possible. Nothing's closer than code that's running on your device. But then you hit this pragmatic, practical limit where to invest the amount of resources in your web app to reproduce an app that's like on iOS, there's obviously too much to do there. Most people just don't get to it. They make a link and they kick off an effect, and then they move on to the next feature because they have a backlog of 200 issues or whatever. And so something like Remix is a nice balance, like you were saying. And part of the goal of the course, and the thing I think is most important to take away when you learn Remix, is understanding the skeleton of the app, how it can rely on browsers and HTTP, and still, again, augment it, enhance it with the full power of React. So as we go through, that's how we build it. And that's how I build my side projects too. And I think it's a good way to learn it because you can basically get very far using loaders to load data for a new route. So when you make a new route, for example, you go to edit an entry, you click edit.
Yeah, let's go
keep going through the app.
Let's go back. Yeah. So how does the entry get in the database? Like, because you say you have the homepage.
Right. So we actually build this first, but if you come to the app completed, you would see all the entries there. Then we also show a form in the homepage that lets you create new entries. It has a date, it has a type, work, interesting thing, or learning, and then it has a text area where you can just write a little note. So that form is right there in the index page. And you type that, and then you hit save. So how do you create something? This is another part of an application architecture from Remix that relies on the web fundamentals, which is forms and post requests. And when you use a form, the capital form component from Remix, again, it's nice because you submit a form, and in PHP or Rails, you handle it, you get the response. The request has all the data from the HTML form, and then you write code in like a controller somewhere to create it, and then you return a response. And Remix is very similar. You submit a form, and then as soon as you submit the form, it's really nice. The Remix dev server will say, you submitted a form, but you haven't defined an action in this route. So you get per route actions, again, right alongside your loader and your page component. So then you export a function called action, and it just gets in the form data as an argument and the request. And there you can grab a handle to your database. In our case, we use Prisma to create a new entry, and then we return success.
Cool. Do you return? Oh, because I was thinking more in like Rails, you would do like a redirect or something.
Right.
But you're all on a single page here.
So this is the cool thing. So if you were to go through a server-side framework tutorial from bare bones, typically you would have a link that says new, create a new issue or something. You see the form, you submit it, you write the code that I just described. And then if you successfully create the entry, if it's valid, let's say the data is valid, then you return a redirect. And in a server-side framework, the browser gets the response, which contains a redirect, and the browser follows the redirect back to the index page. And in so doing, it's the same effective thing as clicking Command R on the refresh on the homepage, on the index page. So it's regenerating the index page from the server after creating it, which means you're going to see the latest version of that, including the thing you just created. This is an important disconnect between the loader and the action that created it. Because again, if you've been writing SPAs with Create a React App using client-side data fetching libraries like Apollo or React Query, there is this notion of a cache that's on the client and it has a certain snapshot of the server-side data. And when you mutate something, you create something, you need some way for that cache to update again.
To also update.
Because
you might have changed something in
you
the
might
cache.
have changed something in the cache. So again, this is where like, oh, but we want to be able to instantly navigate. I've already loaded these posts. It's really cool when I have an SPA and I click it and I've already been there and it's instant because the client knows how to render it. But when you make a change, how do you refresh it? And then you get into manually doing all this stuff. And when you manually do it, it's really easy to miss these edge cases. So the way Remix does it is, again, inspired by the way the web works and server-side frameworks work, except it's not. It's doing less because it's an SPA. So in the form on the homepage, you click save, and then the homepage just updates. And it's because of that distinction between actions and loaders. Remix says, okay, we just had a successful action. Actions potentially change the backend. So now let's look at the current route hierarchy and rerun any loader that is rendering this, that is powering the data, the dynamic data for this page. It reruns the loader, and then the page updates. And so you see the new data there. And it's pretty, I gotta say, it's pretty magical the first time you do this, because you probably have not been able to do this as easily before using Remix, for sure. Like, I'm just gonna say that, because there is no framework right now that has production features that link these two aspects together in as seamless of a way. So
and tied to like the route that you're currently working in.
Yes,
yeah.
all of it.
Just to kind of, because you went really fast there. So in a server-side framework, you submit the form, you do a post request to a server writes data to a database, redirects you back to the index. That redirect basically causes you to refetch the index and see your updated data. From your point of view as a user sitting in front of the browser, like, you don't actually see the browser like going through those hoops of redirect. So you just see the page feel like it refreshes.
Right. And
you see all the data. But with Remix, when you submit the form, you're going to take that form and run an action on the server. And then when the server is like, okay, action done, and then you rerun the loader. So you never actually leave the page. Like, there's no redirect or anything. Like, it is really cool, because it's like the what you want, the part you like about the SPA.
Yes, exactly. So there's a couple things here. So you can return a redirect from an action, and it will do that. It will just say, let's redirect it, and we'll just render this page fresh. But if you don't, it just says, all right, let's rerun the loaders to make sure. And so you get the benefit. Again, it's an important boundary in the architecture that having actions and loaders separate, but also having Remix comprehend what they are semantically. Because, right, if I were to like load a new child route that has a loader, Remix is not going to rerun the loaders up here. But an action semantically means change server-side data. So it automatically links all these things up. And because it comprehends your route hierarchy through the file system and React Router, it knows that I only need to run these loaders, right? Because the loaders are just functions. You can think of them like API endpoints. Like, they're just functions that the server runs and responds. How does it know it needs to run these three functions for the loaders for this route hierarchy? Well, it's because it knows that this is the page that's rendered. And so again, the client can request, oh, give me the new data for these. But that's the amazing part. That's effectively the same as the server-side thing. But you're on a client React app. It's an SPA. You have a React component rendered that could be stateful, has used state. You've clicked a counter 3 times. Then you submit the form. Your counter still says 3, but all your loaders update. And that's where it's a beautiful thing, because you're maintaining the client-side state. Whereas in the traditional server-side app, if you get a redirect,
new page.
It's a new page, and it's as if you clicked refresh the whole time. So from the beginning. So it's really cool to see those parts coming together.
It's also really awesome that just by marking a function as loader, you tell the framework, I load data.
Right.
And by marking his function as action, you're telling the framework, I mutate data.
Right.
And from there, the framework can make some like really awesome assumptions. When an action runs, I should probably rerun all my loaders.
Exactly.
Because that data might have changed.
It's the easiest, obvious way. It's what, again, a vanilla Rails app would do effectively, because you're like reloading the page. So it's like, yeah, that's the easiest way to do it. Just refresh, just re-render it from scratch. But like down in the hood, it's just having to rerun those loaders, and you get to keep the client-side state. But it's a great heuristic to have that makes the development experience very easy, right? It's a heuristic that makes sense, that is going to keep your UI up to date with the actions that the current session is taking without you having to think about anything.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's ways to configure if you wanted a WebSocket event to re-render a loader, if you wanted certain loaders to not revalidate or to revalidate. But at a baseline heuristic, we get through the entire course building in this way and never having to think about manually refreshing or evicting a cache or rerunning loaders, because you stick to the convention. So again, one of the things I think is important for people maybe who haven't used frameworks like this before is to understand the conventions and just use them. And it's easy. I remember when I started, like, you get these clever ideas. Oh, I could just do this and like use an effect or an event handler and like hit an API endpoint. Let's say you're using like a service, a liking service or something, and you just are used to writing like on click fetch to API, whatever Twitter thing or something, and you click on it and you do it. Oh, and then like in the then I'll just update this thing right here. That's kind of like when you're using Remix the way it should be used. When you're using Remix in the way that it's intended to be used, that would still be an action, right? And some of the things that they talk about in the docs are like deleting is just like a single button. It's an action. It's an action. You do the server side thing, and that triggers the loaders to re-render. So when you stay in those lines that they've drawn for you, and of course there's ways to go outside of them when you need to, but when you stay in the lines, everything works like very, very simply. It's a very magical experience. And there's so much code you don't write that you're used to writing in the past. So it's pretty awesome.
Really awesome.
So that's basically how you create entries. You read entries, and then we also have a way to edit them. Edits use like a dynamic URL, which is kind of what you'd expect. Goes to a new page, but is all the same flow. Again, the cool thing about loading here is if you've used other tools, you might often run into a situation where you're building a feature. This is really cool. You're building a feature and you click to get to the feature and it goes to a new URL and the app's in a good state, and then you build it and it works. And then eventually you find out if you're on that page and you refresh it, there's like some state that you actually passed along from the first screen. So this is another part of the key part of the architecture is like when the state should be, when the UI should be derived from the URL, it is, and it makes it easy to do it. So this is something I call in the course. If you find yourself doing weird things with trying to pass data along with a link or using local storage or React state in order to get the page to work, you're probably thinking about it wrong. You probably just need a loader or an action on a route. It's like you should be able to build the entire app with loaders, actions, and routes and not use state and not use effects, and everything should always be in sync when you make a mutation. That's kind of like the skeleton of the app, and it's the skeleton of any web app, right? And then you could layer these things in. But fundamentally, if you have links and forms and loaders and actions, that's the core. So we have an edit route where you click a link to go to the edit. Just because you have the entry already loaded doesn't mean you pass it along. You just render the URL and then you reload the entry from the URL using the ID. That renders the page, and then it's a form that you can use to update it. You can redirect back, and then we also have a delete button. And delete is its own form that runs an action that deletes it and has its own kind of branch of logic in the action for that page. But it's really cool because once you get the first feature done and you learn about these kind of four main pieces, you just keep doing the same thing. And it feels like this is so easy because you're just doing the same thing over and over again. Then we add like login, and login has like the specifics around cookies that we talk about. And I'll share a video actually because I posted this lesson on Twitter, and I think it's a cool standalone one because it's a nice explanation of cookies because Remix makes it easy to see all the pieces. But at the end of the day, you're doing the same thing. Login is a route. Does it need any data to render this? Well, yeah, if I'm already signed in, it should say you're signed in or redirect. If you're not, it should show you the form. And handling the form submission is an action. It's just that the action creates a cookie if the credentials are right, redirects. It's all the same thing over and over again. So that's the basic architecture of the app. And one thing I just wanted to make sure to call out in this podcast is that because of the way Remix came on the scene and the emphasis on web fundamentals, there's sometimes where you kind of get people who are like feeling like they should be avoiding React APIs or feel like they're wrong if they use effect or use state. We've also seen this with React Server Components. You just finished a React Server Components course where you explain how to build a user table that loads data in a server component, but you also use client features to do things like debounce a search input to show an instant loading spinner as soon as someone types. And this is the point I want to make. These frameworks, and I'll just focus on Remix because that's the focus of this episode, they're not saying that React APIs should be avoided. The argument really of the Remix framework is that these core parts, the backbones of the web, are just better handled by this client-server HTTP model because it just makes it easier. And browsers have had 20 years to evolve and handle 30 years to do this. And so all it takes is for you to write one page and feel like, oh yeah, that's way, way easier. And maybe you do that and you're like, shoot, you see people excited about this on Twitter. I just built, a 10-page app that has CRUD functionality for all these resources, and I didn't use a single effect or a single piece of state. And you might be like, oh, every time I should feel bad if I use state or use effect.
I mean, a few minutes ago, you just said, "Oh, you should be able to build the bare bones without effects or states," which is true.
It is true. So, I wanted to highlight here that even though that's true, it's wrong to draw the conclusion that you should avoid them.
Exactly.
The right conclusion is that of everything your user can do in your interface, let's figure out the things that are better suited for HTTP and these framework APIs, and then figure out the things that are better suited for React APIs.
Yeah, we're still this conversation, we're trying to figure out how to communicate this. But it's not, you can build a basic CRUD app without effects or state, but that does not mean that effects or state should never be used.
Right.
They're really good at transient state that lives in the client. Actually, can you give us some examples of when in a Remix app you would go for use state?
Yes. So I can do the use effect one actually. And in the case of the homepage, so we end up extracting an entry form, which is a component that takes in an entry and lets you edit it. If you don't pass in an entry, it starts out, everything is blank. And this is just a nice little pattern because there's a create new entry form embedded on the homepage if you're signed in once we get through authentication. Or when you go to edit, there's an edit form, and it's just the same component, which is cool. And however, on the homepage, we wanted to make it so that you type in an entry and you hit enter, submit, you create a new entry, and the loader is rerun, and you see the new entry in the list. But all the data is still there. And so when we're building this feature, we're like, oh, it'd be nice if this cleared out, and
the form resets.
The form resets,
Yeah.
and I could just enter another one, just like most apps work that are like to-do apps or anything like this. So this is a perfect use case for an effect. Once the state of the component has finished submitting, which you get by using something called a fetcher, which is like a decorated form. You can think of it like that. Then you know that the data has been submitted and the loaders have rerun. And so let's go ahead and clear out these inputs. So you write an effect to do that, and it works great. And that is the kind of thing that's JavaScript. You want to wait until the data is updated, and you can even keep the date the same, right? So let's say I changed the date to last week, and I add some stuff and submit it. Now I just want to keep the category and the date the same, but go back to the text input. If you didn't have React or JavaScript, if you had to basically do a full refresh, you couldn't do that. But that's how you can enhance the user experience using React, because you're in an SPA environment.
It's a perfect example of using the HTTP semantics for things like submitting a form, actions, but then using React for those SPA client-side features, resetting the form, or resetting the form. It's very simple, but
very simple, but it's very easy to do in React, and very hard if you try to contort that resetting form aspect of the feature into HTTP, right? You could imagine someone trying to do this by adding a query param to the URL.
Yeah.
Something like that would like keep the date the same. Or even like you change the date and you add it to the URL because people are like, I'm using Remix. Isn't the URL good? No. This is like the URLs for loading data. This is like transient state, right? And there's all sorts of features you can think of like this. So this is like this really cool aspect of Remix where you build the backbone of the feature and then you get to enhance it and decorate it using React APIs. Another example is instead of having the form right there, you could click a button and show it in a modal, right? Because we're in React, we can use Radix, we can use Headless UI, we can use all these things. But nothing about showing it in the modal should change the fact that the form is actually a capital F form, that submitting it hits an action. It's this really nice integration that you can pull off things like, oh, once the form is submitted, dismiss the modal, and you don't have to contort React features into server-side APIs in the same way that it was wrong for us to contort server-side functionality into React APIs like useEffect that weren't really designed for it. So that, I think, is the most important takeaway, is that Remix can make any experience that you want, and the core pieces help you start out on the 10th floor and take care of all the things that are the same between all of our apps. Changing data, making sure the UI is in sync with the latest server state, navigating around, all of that stuff, deriving it from the URL so you can share it. All of that stuff is taken care of, but then you get to use React to enhance it and go to town, just like you did when you first fell in love with React and started writing SPAs and create React app, you know? Mm-hmm. So, that's the takeaway. And the work journal is going to be a really cool little app that you can do and you can go to town with, and you can add animations or whatever you want to do, but it's a solid starting point. And basically the end of the course is admin authentication, error handling, and then some polish, and then deploy it. So that's kind of where we're at. But I wanted to have a podcast out there where we talk about the important parts of the Remix architecture, because not only because I think Remix is awesome and it's super fun, I think today, for a brand new person wanting to learn a server-side framework, because of the way actions and loaders are together, I think it is an awesome way to learn basically HTTP and the semantics of request response and how that works with back and forward and navigation. It's all there, and it's a really elegant story tied together. And then again, to the last few weeks, talking about RSC, which the creators of Remix are experimenting with on how to integrate it into Remix right now. You see some similar kinds of things being said, like, how do I do this? I know I could create a client component, but I'm trying to avoid that because I'm using RSC. And again, that's like, you don't want to contort a feature that requires the mouse position into something that doesn't use a client component. We have client components. The whole point is that we can integrate these things in a seamless way. Remix does so by letting you define actions, loaders, and page components in the same file. RSC lets you do it by composing them in the tree, but it's the same idea. It's a seamless way to not step out of the React programming model and then use APIs that do things for you in a way that feels really seamless and like you're building a single app. Mm-hmm. Even though, to your point, you really have two apps. And in this case, you really do as well. There's really two apps. You're deploying endpoints. Your server is running and your client is running. Your server is acting like a request response stateless HTTP server, just like a PHP or Rails server. And your client is acting like an SPA, because it is. And it's stateful, and it can have things that are transient, that are just specific to that user session. And it's how can we have these two things work together.
Mm-hmm. And the Remix example would be like your loaders and actions, or like the server side app and your React app.
Exactly.
And, but Remix is able to blend those two, so they feel like one app, but also too you can like server render the components, the routes, all that stuff.
Yep.
So yeah,
Yep.
yeah, it is actually a great way for developers that are interested in learning more about HTTP. That's a really good point.
And you get to do it while like writing JSX, which you're familiar with, but not using state and effects.
Exactly. You don't have to go. I have to go start from ground, like from the 0th floor, and I have to learn Ruby on Rails to gain this knowledge of what a request response cycle app looks like.
It's actually a really good way to put it, is that you can see how far you can get without using React specific features like state and effects, right? If React didn't have state or effects, it would just be a templating language, which is what server-side frameworks have. But it's one you already know. So if you use Remix and don't allow yourself to use state and effects, you're actually going to learn a ton about the web, and you're going to see how far you can go in building it. And then you're going to see interactions where you're like, wow, this is really a bummer that, like in my work journal, in my OneRep Max app, which was one of my first Remix apps, I have a form and I want to add sets. How would you do that in a Rails app? How would you do that if you didn't have React State? It's actually kind of a bummer. You click plus and the whole page re-renders with a 4th row. You click plus and it re-renders with a 5th row. And maybe you're using a query param to build up a form, or you're submitting it one at a time, right? You're adding a set one at a time. I want to do the kinds of things I've been doing in React, like I press plus and the new row just animates down and I haven't lost any state. That's the kind of thing you can't do with all of these pieces just on the server.
To be fair, yes, you cannot. To be fair, the server frameworks would say, oh, like just add a inline script tag and add JavaScript that, does insert HTML.
But that's good, right?
But now you're leaving the you're just in another language.
You're in another language, right?
You're another language. It's not to be fair, it's not a language you want to be in.
Yeah.
So you're going to look for ways to avoid going there.
Yeah, exactly. But this is I'm not even making a comment about
I know.
Yes.
It's really cool though with compare that to the Remix example.
Right.
You stay writing everything in React, but it's just JSX as a templating language. Then when you need to go add the dynamic bits, it doesn't feel like a bummer.
Yes.
It doesn't feel like, oh, I have to go use this other language. Oh, I have to go use, take like a backend developer doesn't want to write JavaScript. You could say the same thing of a front-end developer doesn't want to go off and write Python or Ruby.
Exactly.
So if you make them feel like, oh, in order to do this, you have to go write Ruby, go write Python, they're going to be like, that's a bummer. I don't want to do that. But the beauty of Remix is you get to stay in this architecture in JSX so that when you do have to add those SPA dynamic bits, it's like, oh yeah, this is, I'm looping over a list the same way I'm looping over a list that comes from the database. It doesn't feel like a bummer.
Exactly. It's exactly what you said like a year ago when we first started using it. And you were like, there is no upgrade path. I need an auto select. I can install Radix and use it.
That was you that said that.
No, remember you said there was no, or maybe you said mind virus or whatever. It's the mind virus. Like it kind of like ruins the old architecture for you in the best way. But there's no upgrade path. You can add a multi-select combo box from Radix or whatever. You can add React State and loop over it and return LI elements in your JSX. But I think for someone who hasn't done this, again, you can see how far you can get without it. Not because using state is bad, because if I can do it without state, it's going to make my life easier. That's really how you should think about it. And in the same way, you can fetch data in an effect using...
We should be clear when we say it, we don't mean everything.
Right.
We mean
the things that Remix gives you APIs for that are handled by HTTP, the things that they talk about in the marketing
loading
materials
data.
and the website when they say it's based on web fundamentals. It's loading data, it's navigating, it's forms, it's links, and actions. Loaders, actions, forms, and links. Those are the big ones. And just because you can load data in an effect, right, you're going to see that it's much easier to do it. But there's nothing easier than rendering a dynamic form using React State. So you should do that using React State. Mm-hmm. And there's no problem with how those things play together. In fact, the framework is designed for those to play together.
It's pretty cool. You can go to I like taking these like little examples and just going trying to get to a conclusion. So you're building like a Photoshop or Figma style app. And so you are going to have tons of client-side APIs, tons of state. Like
Right.
you're just going to naturally have big stateful components, but that doesn't mean anything about how you save the data has to change.
Exactly.
It's still going to be, in Remix's case, a form that submits, but you don't have to throw away all the server code
Exactly.
that you think about with that. So yeah,
Exactly.
it's pretty cool.
You know, funny you say that because my brother's actually he's a programmer and he's artist as well, but he's done a lot of 3D stuff. And when he was doing an app for himself, he had the dashboard part. You can think of like the controls part of Figma, let's say, and he brought in React to do it, like embedded in like a C++ app or something. Whereas the main app was like a 3D canvas that lets you manipulate 3D objects.
Oh,
but
cool.
React is so good for the controls, setting state, re-rendering, having things respond, and then like saving preferences, logging in, logging out, right? So to your point, any app that interacts with the internet has features that are at the backbone of this that involve request response, HTTP, saving data, loading data. That's what you want to use these APIs for. And as soon as you want to do something else, you shouldn't feel like once you learn it, then don't feel bad or good. It's just you're just using the appropriate thing, and it's making your life easier. But you want to feel like you can use the full power of React. You can install these UI libraries. You can use all this stuff. And again, in the same way that client components in a Next app or any app that has RSC should not feel like you shouldn't feel bad about that. You should use them where they're appropriate. And if you find yourself using either a client-side API...
Can I interrupt here? Because like, I think what I see when people ask me these questions, they're not able to distinguish, should this be
Right.
client-side, should this be server-side? And because I'm doing it client-side, but let's take the Remix. Mm-hmm. You say like I can write in the backbone of an entire app without using state or effects.
Yes.
So then they get to a point where they use state, and to them the question is basically, do I need to use state here? And it's hard to know if it's hard to know if that answer is true, because we would say, oh, you just use state when you need to use state.
Yes.
But they're saying.
Well, that's why I made a course. No, really. I mean, it's trying, and that's why I would say, even if you don't watch the course, when you start using Remix, see how far you can get building the backbone of an app.
So
and again, the course is because I tried to explain what I mean by that. But I think that's what lets you do that. Whereas,
well, as a good heuristic for this, like build as much as you can without using state, and then when it's like you can't, if it's like, oh, this would be so much easier if I could just use state, like that's the heuristic that's like, yes, you should be using state.
It's hard to define in a single way when that point is, because me having experience enough building SPAs and server-side apps with server-side frameworks knows that when I get to my dynamic form, this is appropriate use for React State. Whereas we've seen people, that are comfortable using Apollo or whatever. And so
I'm just going to skip the loader.
I'm going to use the loader, and then I'm going to pass that data into the Apollo cache, and now I'm back in my happy land. But what you're not getting or seeing is that you've disconnected the boundary between actions and loaders in the page and the current route hierarchy. Remix has no knowledge of what's going on in Apollo's cache. So you want to remove that and use forms and loaders to do all your things. You don't want Apollo to be sending off a use mutation, because now you've opted out of all of the enhancements that the framework provides in terms of keeping your UI in sync and all this stuff. Same with like the URL. Oh, Remix said use the URL. So I get search params in my page. Great, now I'm going to throw that in state, and I'm going to start setting state when someone clicks around. But then as soon as you do that, Remix doesn't know about your state. If you refresh, you're back to square one. You haven't updated the URL. So that's why it's important to learn how the pieces fit together and to stay inside of those lines and to understand how you can. I think of it how you can go outside the lines without abandoning those pieces. I think of it like animation. A lot of people do animation in a way that sometimes steps out of React altogether, and you get in these situations where like it messes up. Instead, you want to generally think about animation as you build your thing with React, and then you layer the animation in, which is one of the reasons I like Framer Motion so much, because it's state-based animation, and you could comment out all of the Framer Motion code, and the UI would still work completely because you've layered the animation on, but you haven't abandoned any of the UI as a function of state and the re-rendering benefits of declarative rendering that React gives us. So that's how I think about this too. You want to use these actions loaders, links and forms, and the URL in the way that Remix explains, and then you layer the things in that are extra, right? For example, in the case of the dynamic form, you use React state and you add some sets. If I were to refresh, it's going to render the default thing, but that's fine in this case, right? So that tells me that the state is okay for that. Or I go to a new, right? Whereas if you had something based on a search and you start typing and you had used an effect to set state and now you update the state, then you can't share your search results anymore, you know? So I think that's the most important thing to learn for folks who are newer to this. And when you do, it's an absolute blast. It's like, it is so much fun to add new features to a Remix app. It really is. So
Really cool.
sweet.
Really cool.
Awesome. So yeah, if you want to hear when that course is ready, then I'll add a link to our newsletter because that's how we share all this information. I'll add that to the podcast. Otherwise, it should be out a week or two after this episode comes out.
Yeah, buildui.com/newsletter.
There you go.
Sign up. We send, we're definitely going to have a whole bunch of updates, free Remix content too.
Yep.
Around all this. So,
Absolutely. Cool, man. All right. You want to wrap it there?
Yeah, it's good.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.
Bye.